Talking Remote, our live channel for all the remote things. And today I have the dubious or indubitable pleasure, so more dubious than indubitable, pleasure of introducing our founder, Andrew Blain from Remote AF. How are you, Andrew?
I'm great, thanks, Tony. How are you?
Fantastic. It's great to have you here.
You look nice and warm. Where are you calling in from today, Tony?
So Andrew has pointed out the fact that I live on a tropical island and I'm wearing a jumper, but I do have the air conditioning on, so I could wear this jumper because it is a branded RAF jumper. Whereas Andrew's living in the mountains and he's freezing, so there we go.
Yes, you are truly remote AF, Tony.
I am indeed, and you're about to be even more. All right, let's, without further ado, because we are live and running, so let's talk about today's topic, which is the impacts of scale planning on asynchronous work. I think before we get stuck into that, let's start with framing around what do we mean by async work, particularly from Remote AF's thoughts around that, because we've been doing this for over 3 years odd now. What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Yeah, look, I think if you think about the mission of our organisation, we think that in the future, people will look back at kind of the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and they'll look at pictures of people travelling in on trains with their heads stuffed into other people's underarms. They'll look at pictures of people working in cubicles in buildings, and they'll think that was really weird. Why on earth did anyone ever do that? So we kind of think that office work will be a curious relic of the industrial age, and we believe that work in the future will be done from when and where people feel like they're most effective. And that's really kind of the principle behind asynchronous work. We all have different circadian rhythms. We all have different ways that we like to live our lives. Some people love to get up early and exercise. Some people like to paddle around in the ocean to start their day. Other people like to sleep in and do their exercise or their fun later in the day, and maybe wake up a bit dusty the next morning. It doesn't really matter which of those you are. You should be able to design a workday where you're effective. And I think kind of the principle of a team that is working asynchronously is that we find the moments to connect, and we find the moments where everyone's going to be in a great space for collaboration. But outside of those moments, we want to break the work up so that we can do it largely independently. And that enables people to work from where they'd like to work, maybe travel and work as a digital nomad, maybe go and sit on a tropical island in Queensland and spend their life there and not have to tackle the traffic or ever cross the bridge that they so dislike crossing. And I think that's work of the future.
Yeah, I like that, and we here at RAF call that location agnostic for those that are listening, because I think it's it's wherever you want to work, whatever time, wherever it's necessary, and it's very important. All right, we're going to take that the next step, and we're talking about scale planning. So I do want to just qualify that a little bit, because the word scale planning immediately evokes the inference that we're talking about one particular framework, but we're not here. We're talking about scale planning of any kind of scaling in terms of that across organisations. Talk to me a little bit about that, Andrew.
Yes, so if we think about knowledge work, what we've learned about knowledge work over the years is that planning has to occur with the people that are doing the work. When you get planning really wrong with knowledge work is when you try and take people who are not involved in the work and get them to do the planning of the work. And that certainly happened a lot in the 90s, in the early 2000s, where we basically try and get kind of the project managers or the senior people in an organization in a room to say, how long is this stuff going to take? What do we have to do? What's the right way to do it? All of that sort of stuff. And we package that up for someone else to deliver, who had no context of that conversation and had no real understanding of how they reached those decisions, why they reached those decisions. And over time, when you're working in that kind of fashion, the people who are making the decisions around planning get further and further away from the work and from how you solve the actual problems. And the people who are doing the work get further and further away from the planning. And so these silos emerge and things get chucked over fences and people get pretty upset with each other. So scaled planning is the idea that you bring everyone who's got to contribute to an outcome together, you put them in a space, you spend some time trying to shape up the work, and you come out of that with a plan that you hopefully meet.
All right. So if we take those two elements we've just talked about and we push them together, then the question being is, why is scale planning really difficult with async teams? And let me just preface that in saying we're asking that question because we know that question gets asked. And over the period of time that we've been doing, you've been doing this as many years as I have, and we'll just say we're not young. Literally, we do see that becomes a problem, Andrew.
Yeah, look, I think one of the key things is when you set up an async team, one of the things you're going to do is sit there and kind of go, all right, well, let's talk about each other's lives, and we're gonna work out when we're best to work. And often what you're talking about is teams that are in different jurisdictions. So you could have teams in different time zones, different states. You could have teams in the same time zone who want to work at different parts of the day. And kind of what you're trying to land on is what Mark Kilby and Jonah Rothman call the golden hours, which are the moments where everyone's together. And when you're setting up an async working agreement, you're kind of like trying to meet that point in the middle and go, all right, well, let's make sure that the stuff that we need to do together, we are really focused on keeping that time for. The other time is a little bit less precious to us, but that's the core time that we're saving for our team. And often in an async team, particularly if you've got people that are moving around or if you've got people in different time zones, that's a very small time slot. So that's the first problem. You've got limited time to get people together for scale planning. I think the second thing is that most of the planning models that are out there are built around the idea that you can get people in a room and you can get them in a room for an extended period of time. So it's kind of like, I mean, if I go right back to the original thing that we heard of in Agile, which was big room planning, which kind of, there was a whole bunch of derivatives that came off that. PI planning is one of those, but all of the scaled planning ceremonies are built around the idea that you can get people together and you can get them together for a period of time to do things. That breaks unless you're prepared to make planning kind of a core ceremony that people travel to. And that can happen. So some organizations will say that we'll get together, like we'll work asynchronously, but for a couple of days a quarter, we're going to get together for strategy and planning. We're going to run something in person, and we're going to make it very social and make it work. But a lot of teams that are dispersed or working asynchronously simply don't have the money or the budget to get together in a space and make that happen. The third thing I think is that there is a failure to recognize constraints in planning. And this is something that I kind of think whenever I look at how people do planning, it always seems to be that you get the teams together and you get all the teams to plan out all their capacity without being aware of the constraints. And I'm talking here about constraints from a theory of constraints perspective rather than an Alicia Herrera or Kneffen kind of constraints perspective. there are things that constrain us from getting stuff done. You walk into any organization, you put data over the organization, and the hotspots stand out pretty quickly. There will be some applications that have a lot lower throughput than others. There'll be teams that have a lot lower throughput than others. There'll be individuals in the organization that are just kind of absolutely overloaded because they've got so much knowledge, or they've got privileges or access privileges that no one else has. And you'll find those constraints through the organization. The organization is only ever going to move as fast as those constraints. So often what we're trying to do is put a bunch of people together in a room and pretend that all teams can plan to capacity, whereas the reality is value is going to flow at the speed of those constraints. So unless we're doing things to identify constraints, plan around the constraints, and also make sure that we're doing work to improve the throughput of the constraints, uh, there's a lot of folly in planning that's happening at the moment. I think in asynchronous work that becomes a bigger challenge as well, because you just don't have the stompy feet, or the walk around to someone's desk and tap them on the shoulder and say, "Hey, you got to do this for me," that you do, because and people aren't available at the same, I suppose, with the same responsiveness as you might get in work that you're doing synchronously or together.
Yeah, and I think what we see is, and we continuously see, and what you've talked about there is really that whole premise of just replicating what we've always done in a physical space into an environment, digitality. We work and we live in an environment of digital when we're working in these remote situations. So you have to change that. So having said that, how would we do that differently? Because you've called a number of things out there, but I think the interesting thing for people is to hear your version of what we would change.
Yeah, so I think when I think about how you do scaled planning effectively with asynchronous teams, first and foremost, you've got to respect the hours of overlap. So you might be able to get teams to agree to expanding the hours of overlap that they have uh, for for planning purposes, but you don't want to be extending those hours of overlap beyond the point where people are going to be effective. You're going to have to plan remotely. We all know that sitting in remote working sessions is a little bit more fatiguing than sitting in-person sessions. You don't get the same bounce and energy from the individuals in the room that you do when you're remote. You also so you've got the reduced energy, but also when people are meeting people for the first time in a remote setting, there's a different dynamic to what there is in an in-person session. So sometimes it takes a little bit more to get I suppose the introverts. Introvert's probably a bad word, but the people who are less comfortable with just kind of coming to a conversation and really participating, it's often harder as a facilitator to draw that out of them. So that's kind of the first challenge is how do you make the actual the event that you're running run in a much shorter time frame and be effective in that shorter time frame. The second thing I think is cadence. When you're investing in an in-person planning event that's going to run over a couple of days and it's going to involve a lot of people, you're talking about a lot of investment in making sure things are set up correctly. So you've got to book rooms, you might have to book a space that's external. You've got to make sure calendars are all lined up. You've probably got catering concerns. You're trying to make this, you need to prep the space to make it really presentable and all that sort of thing. You don't need to do all of that to make a remote event work for asynchronous teams. So you can kind of I suppose the transaction cost of the event is lower, which allows us to do it more frequently. And more frequent planning with smaller planning events is something that's really useful in that context. The third thing I think is identify the constraints going in. So try and understand what are the key things in the system that prevent work from progressing. And don't go into the session until you've actually spent some time trying to work out how you will alleviate those constraints. So it might be you've got a bunch of stuff that you want to do, but when you map all that work in, you find that it's hitting one or two teams out of 6 or 7 that you have in your planning event. That's probably a trigger for you to think about whether there's some things that you could tweak from an op model perspective, whether you could shuffle some people around, whether you could make some changes at a lightweight level, which would alleviate that constraint. Or you might find that things are getting stuck somewhere. Rather than jumping into planning, work out whether there's something that you could do to stop things getting stuck that you could execute to free up for the next planning event, and really focus on how do we not just do the work, but continually improve the system of work and the operating model so that we are getting better at getting work through. And that kind of leads to number 4, which is don't be afraid to make really minor tweaks to the operating model. So the structure of teams, the people in teams, kind of team boundaries, or the interface between teams, or the API between teams, or or even just the way that work flows, the way that you do things, in order to make things flow better. I think it's really key to continuously evolve the operating model to make planning work better, and that allows you to plan in a shorter time box. It allows you to plan in shorter cycles, and it also improves the throughput of the system.
Let me dig a little bit deeper. I just listening to what you're saying there. So, firstly, one I want to dig deeper in. You talked about duration of planning in terms of the duration of doing the planning. But I also want to just look at that because we here at Remote AF talk about it as group planning, and within the group planning we talk about continuous wave planning. Used to be known as short wave, but it's been that term's been used for other things. Continuous wave planning rather than the big quarterly cycles, because we know those cycles they're crammed into to match funding or to match the cycle of the organisation. And the reality is, as soon as they're planned, 9 times out of 10 they're out of date because someone comes in and make it so number one. I get to do that with my haircut, by the way. Make it so number one command. And so that's one of the things that even when you're in physical, doesn't work. But then the minute you put a remote frame over the top, it becomes even harder, Andrew. So talk to us a little bit about that group planning and your thoughts on that size and shape.
Yeah, again, I think it comes back to transaction costs. I think part of the reason that we went to that quarterly planning cycle at scale was the finance, the way that things are financed. And often, even with a quarterly planning cycle, you're dealing with having to adapt to annual finance processes, which is a bit of a pain. But you can build an adapter at both ends of the process so that you're kind of going, all right, well, we'll take a kind of initiative business case or an annual business case, and we'll break that into the thing that makes sense. And then what we'll come out with in the plan and our reporting beyond that will kind of match back to the language that finance wants to hear, which it's not ideal, but it's something that we have to work with. The other point is what I mentioned earlier, which is really like planning in person when you're talking about big teams is a giant pain to set up. If you're working in an organization like some of the organizations that I've worked in the past have, like, I think one of them had up to like 27 different big teams that needed to find place and time to do their planning. And in that context, you were talking about kind of pre-planning sessions where people were allocating out kind of teams and budget and stuff before they even got into the planning sessions. And then you have a post-planning session after that to try and work out how you're going to reallocate things. All of that stuff is mess that is due to the way you set up. There's complexity to everything that you're trying to do. Like at a small scale, things are hard. At a large scale, things are harder. But often what we do is try and plan around the mess rather than fixing the mess and then making planning easier. And I think if you're focusing, if you're focusing on how do we make it easier for the teams to plan before you go into planning, then that is a fundamental shift in the way that you're thinking about things. And that might mean that you're altering team composition. It might mean that you're shifting people around. It might mean that you need to go to market for skills that you don't have in a certain teams. It might mean that you have to create a pseudo team that once was two teams that are going to work together for a duration to nail something. We love long-lived teams. Science supports long-lived teams and the idea that if you keep a group of people together, they will become more effective. But I can tell you from experience running organizations that the average tenure of the people that you tend to deal with in the systems that we're talking about means that the likelihood of you, the mathematical probability of you keeping a group of people together in a team for more than 6 months is quite small, and it gets smaller very quickly. So I love high performance teams. I love the idea that you keep teams together. But if it makes the work easier to plan and execute, I'd rather temporarily break up a high performance team and put people in a pseudo team or in a construct that's going to help the work to get done than try and keep the high performance team together forever. You can certainly put them back into that team afterwards, but if there's stuff that's going to really break the way that you're trying to plan and execute work, I'd rather the operating model was fluid.
Yeah, and that plays into two things, I think. So that's, we talk about dynamically adaptive organizations, right? And what we mean by dynamically adaptive organizations is, as you said, shout out to Heidi Heflin, dynamic reteaming. It is going to happen, so do it in a way that's going to work well for your organization. And then dynamically changing your operating design. And that's the one I wanted to dig into a little bit more, right? So you touched on it, and you touched on it there. But what are the sort of things that you look for to change in that operating design? And then we've got a few questions coming out in a minute as well, Andrew, so I'll just key you up for those. But we'll just get through this one, and then we'll look at those. I really want to get the essence of the things that you see that cause problems in the operating design and the changes that you like to see happen.
Yeah, if we think about operating models, what are they? First of all, it's how teams and people organize to deliver value. The second thing is how work flows through those teams and people to get out the door. The third thing is what are the things that we need in place to govern the delivery of that value. So that's kind of the operating model. And what you'll find in most organizations is we go into planning and the operating model constrains what we do. The operating model will be optimized for some of the stuff that we're trying to do, but often it will be working against some of the stuff that we want to do as well. So if you're just going into planning sessions every quarter and butting your head against an operating model challenge that is preventing things from being easy, then planning is going to be hard, executing is going to be hard, and the value that you create from the process is going to be suboptimal. If you can sit and identify through data what are the things that are constraining us from delivering value. And you can make tweaks to the operating model, and you can treat it like it's an evolving thing rather than something that you design the as you look at the as is, you design the to be, you drop the to be in, the to be's there forever and a day, and we're going to work that way. If you think instead that the operating model is just something that, like everything else, is going to change, that's when you're talking about an adaptive organization. And there's some really sacred cows there, right? Like there's some sacred cows in industry that you have to break to do that. You have to break the idea that governance is a fixed structure. You have to break the idea that we always govern the system the same, and every part of the organization has to have the same governance model as every other part of it. You've got to break that. You've got to break the idea that ways of working, or the way that value flows through the operating model, is fixed across the organization. And you've got to break the idea that teams and interfaces between teams are fixed things that you change rarely. Otherwise, you're basically just trying to cram work through something that is optimized for the work that the operating model was designed for 2 or 3 years ago, if it was designed well.
Yeah, and I think, and again, as we put remote into that mix, that model that was created X amount of years ago is always going to have to change, because the way you're interacting changes and the way your people are working changes. So you just can't stay static. Like, that's why we call it a dynamically adaptive organization. Dynamically meaning that you make change based on what's happening, and adaptive is obviously because we're going to adapt to it, right? Got a question for you. Just going back to the teaming piece when you were talking about changing the teams. Michael Cook, shout out. Is that related to actual human formation? Andrew is asking.
Yeah, I might need to get you to ask that question differently, Michael, but I'll try and answer it. So I think I did some work. I'll have to publish it at some stage, because I basically got the distribution over the 500 people that I or someone else hired for the consultancy that I ran. I looked at the distribution of the time that people, or the tenure of the people in the organization. And what I was looking for is what's kind of the median amount of time people stayed with us, and also kind of what are the tails of that. So what's the 15th percentile for someone who kind of joined and didn't hang around too long, and what's the 85th percentile for people who have really stayed with the organization for a while. And keep in mind, this is an organization that was fast growing. We had a strong culture. It was an enviable culture. We had great engagement scores, and people loved working with us. I haven't got the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I reckon it was like sort of somewhere between 18 months and 2 years was the median tenure. And we had people that hung around for less than 6 months, and some people that kind of hung around for 10 years plus. So if you put those numbers into a simulation and you kind of work out, all right, let's look at a team of 7 people, for instance, and you try and work out what is the probability that those 7 people with that distribution of tenure is still in the same team in 6 months' time, the results are pretty depressing. And when you extend the amount of time you're looking at, or if you extend the number of people that you're looking at, things get harder. Like you're starting to talk about the chances of a team sticking together for 12 months, 18 months being pretty fractional.
Excellent. And while you were doing that, Michael's qualified as well. So he was really leaning towards the large-scale workshops and getting big planning teams together. That's what you were talking about when he passed that comment.
Yeah, I think actually, yeah. So that is a challenge. Like, actually, Michael, I'm sure you've done this. I know Michael and some of the stuff he's done in the past, trying to get 100, 200 people together for a couple of days. There is a bunch of things that you have to do from an admin perspective that are really painful. And if you've got an organization that is doing that sort of planning across a significant proportion of the organization, there's not a lot of spaces that are going to house that many people. And all the different parts of the organization kind of want to do that work at around the same time. So it gets very, very challenging.
Yeah. And all to create usually a quarterly type plan that's going to change the next day. And financially, if you actually looked at that and looked at the amount of changes and how much that plan changes from when you actually did it, the cost factor just does not make sense. So I concur with that. We've got a question from John as well, and not our John, by the way. But he says, "What can businesses do to keep people in a team, right, rather than let them go?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to answer that in two ways. So my philosophy when I was running the consultancy was that I didn't mind if people left the organization as long as they were going on to do better things. So I kind of felt that if someone joined the organization, worked with us for a short period of time, and then on the basis of the work that they've done, they were able to go on and get a really senior role or move on to something amazing. I was like, hey, hang on. Like, we could see that as a bad thing, and we could go, oh, well, I don't want you to leave. But we could also see it as a really good thing that the organization is so good at developing people and the brand is so strong that when people come into the organization, they leave it in a much better place than they were before. So philosophically, I never minded losing people. And as long as I was losing them to better things, what really annoyed me was when I lost people and they hadn't grown because I felt like I'd failed and that we hadn't got the system wasn't doing the right thing for that person. But in terms of how you keep people in a team, like you keep people in a team if they feel like they are contributing to outcomes. Like if they can feel the energy of solving real customer problems and learning while they're doing it, they hang around because they're motivated, they're engaged, they're excited by the work. If you've got people that feel like they are constantly fighting against the system, you will lose them. And as a consultancy, you feel that because when you put a team into an organization where they're fighting against the system, they come to you about 6 weeks later and say, hey, look, I'm not sure how long I'm going to stick it out here. We might need to change my engagement. And if you leave them in that space and you can't find a way through account management to make the system work for them, you probably lose them.
Okay, I've got one last one for you, and I know you're going to love this because this does come from our CIO, John, and I know he threw it in here to spice you up a tad, but that's okay. He's wondering if a commoditized version of the Apple Vision, the new goggles that came out, Andrew, would make traditional big room planning come back into vogue.
I think John's just a marketing guy. He's growth hacking. He just wants to get Apple Vision into the no brand cuffs, John. Look, I have a certain perspective on VR tools. It's probably not friendly to the people who make VR tools, unfortunately. But they're pretty useful, but I just can't stand personally being in an environment where I don't know what's going on. I know it's immersive and it's amazing and all that sort of stuff, but if I haven't got awareness of what's around me, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe it's it's the same as I'm not super comfortable with being in an office if I've got my back to the whole room because I'm like, I think it's the same sort of thing. So yeah, my perspective on VR and its applicability in the workplace is probably different to those who are advocating for it.
Yeah, I think the goggle piece that perturbs me as well. We did play with a couple of applications where it was VR, it was 3D without the actual goggles, and that was an interesting. And I could see that you could possibly bend it that way, but it's still not quite there for this kind of thing. I don't think, Andrew.
Yeah, I'll wait till we can get the Tom Cruise style Inception thing. You look a lot more like Tom Cruise than I do, Tony. So.
Yeah, righto. Okay, well, we haven't got any more questions, and I think it's been brilliant to have this conversation with you on here. For those that are watching this, if you'd like to continue with this conversation, why don't you join us at remoteaf.co? Click on the community button, and you'll hit our Discord community, and you can continue the conversation. We'd love to have you on that. Listen to all the remote things, and we're really happy to have had you on the cast today. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Tony. Catch you soon.